Hey everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Peggy Northrop. I'm the CEO of Watermark, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to our last panel in Leadership Month. One of the through lines of our programming in recent weeks has been to address the need for us as leaders to have conversations that make us feel uncomfortable. These are sometimes called soft skills, which, let's face it, is a ridiculous term. There is nothing soft about confronting racism, especially when we realize it's not something that happens out there among other people, but in our companies, in our families, in our communities, and in our own hearts. This panel grew out of a number of conversations that Janet and I had over the summer. I had seen her in a panel, I think it was put together by 6 Seconds, the 6 Seconds organization. And I was so struck by her authenticity and her vulnerability and her open-heartedness. So I reached out, it's the way we do these days on Zoom and on LinkedIn. And we started talking, and a phrase that she used, racism is emotions, just stuck with me. And I thought, speaking just for myself, I have a lot of emotions around this topic, and I'm often just at a loss about how to deal with it, particularly in a professional context when so many of us, I certainly did, grew up thinking, don't bring your emotions to work. So all this by way of saying, I need to listen to this panel and learn from this panel today. And I'm so grateful to Janet and to all of you for joining us for this conversation. I'm going to let Janet introduce the rest of our esteemed panelists, but I want to tell you a little bit about her. She spent 25 years in corporate life as a leader at companies including FedEx, IBM, UPS, and Comcast. She is the founder and CEO of Antivos, which is a coaching, learning, and development organization focused on helping leaders be more authentic, and she has clients in 37 countries. Janet, I'm going to let you take it away, and I will rejoin the panel in an hour. Thank you again so much, everyone, for being here.
Thank you, Peggy. I appreciate that introduction and this opportunity. And I want to thank all of you who are in the webinar, and thank you for joining us this morning or this afternoon. I'm proud and humbled to lead crucial conversations as this one that must continue to take place about race in our country. The dual crisis of COVID-19 and the murders of unarmed Black Americans has exposed disparities within our laws, policies, and practices that have created inequities for people of color. This has divided our nation on issues of health, economics, physical and psychological well-being. What role should leaders in business and organizations play in the discussions to resolve the disparities created by this concept of race? And what are the actions needed that will lead to transformational and sustainable change? This brings up an emotional topic. We all have emotions around the subject of race. We've seen how calling out systemic racism in America has affected us. Our emotions may even be the same, but for different reasons. What we know is that emotions we have when we're not in our groups, teams, and organizations may surface when we do come together with others. We can't escape them. Our emotions originate in our brains and are felt throughout our bodies. They are formed in our hypothalamus, stored in our hippocampus, and stored in our hippocampus and triggered in our amygdala. We feel them, we make decisions based on what we feel, and we act on those decisions. When having conversations about race, two of the most frequent comments I hear is, I don't want to make a mistake, or I don't want to offend anyone. As author Sam Horn says, mistakes are doorways to discovery. In our discussion today, we will try not to make many mistakes, but if we do, please have grace with us. We most certainly don't want to offend anyone. However, we will have a courageous and honest dialogue, which we hope reaches our goal of leading to discovery for each of us. I am elated to be joined by this diverse panel from the worlds of business, nonprofit, and ed tech, and they will discuss why the topic of race is such an emotional one, and how leaders can effectively guide their organizations when having these ongoing dialogues. So let me introduce you to our panel. Andrea Hoban is co-founder and head of learning at OG Life Labs and possesses more than 20 years of professional experience in leading and managing large teams. Over the last decade, she's parlayed her in the field background into leadership and development and coaching practices. As a certified coach and speaker, she's helped hundreds of professionals learn to harness their emotions and achieve their goals. Andrea is known as one that, as one of her clients puts it, Will's industry knowledge, emotional intelligence, humor, clever insights, and strong communication skills, which make her highly effective in guiding the growth and development of others. She's married and has a son in high school and a daughter in junior high school. Hi, Andrea.
Hi, Janet. Thanks for having me.
Bill Bedrosian. Bill Bedrosian serves as the CEO of Covenant House, California, and has been there since 2014. His 25 years of child welfare and homeless services experience and Bill's passion for working with youth came from his parents, who were foster parents for 30 plus years and adopted 8 of his 11 siblings through the child welfare system. He began his career in Chicago and matriculated to LA, the LA County Department of Child and Family Services, and also worked at Olive Crest. Bill has a BS degree in Business Administration and Finance and a Master's of Social Work from Loyola University in Chicago. He's also served as an adjunct professor at USC Graduate School of Social Work. He currently lives in Long Beach and with his wife, his beautiful wife, I might add, and he's chasing his 2 sons or hanging out with his brothers, rooting for sports teams from his hometown of Philadelphia. Welcome, Bill.
Thanks, Janet.
Last but not least is James Laduka. And James is Senior Director of Global Inclusion and Diversity at Twitter, where he and his team partner with 5,000 tweets, I like saying that, tweets, on the company's journey to becoming the world's most diverse and inclusive tech company. And if you've read about some of the things with Twitter, they're well on their way. In addition to his role at Twitter, James chairs the San Francisco Human Rights Commission, which focuses on addressing gross injustice against marginalized communities, dismantling structural inequality, and amplifying the voices of those who feel most invisible. He also serves on the LGBTQ Advisory Committee to the U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and is a former senior advisor to the Obama White House. James earned degrees in political science and Spanish. He lives in San Francisco with his husband, Charlie, and their 2 children. Of course, you can follow James on Twitter at James Laduka. Welcome, panel, and thank you for being here. As we talk about leading in a divided culture, and we talk about the subject of race and racism, we must face the realities of today. And some of those realities, we can get facts from the Center of Disease Control, which states that during this COVID crisis, the cases, the hospitalizations, and deaths have been very disparate among the races. For American Indians and Alaskan residents, their cases have been 2.8 times higher. For Blacks and African Americans, 2.6 times higher, and for Latinx, 2.8 times higher than cases for whites in America. Hospitalization rates, 5.3 times, 4.7 times, and 4.6 times higher. And unfortunately, the death rates for American Indians and Alaskans have been 1.4%, for Black Americans, 2.1%, and Latinx, 1.8% higher than those of whites. The rate of fatal police shootings for Black Americans is much higher for any other ethnicity, at being 32 fatal shootings per million for Blacks compared to Latinx at 24 per million, which is 25% less than Blacks. And for whites, the rates are 13 per million, which is less than 50% of the rates of Blacks. With this backdrop of facts that there are systemic discrepancies, let's begin our conversation. So I'll ask this question, panel, if you're ready. I'll ask this question, and I'd like for each of you to answer and share with us your thoughts. The prolific writer James Baldwin said, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced." Why is it imperative that leaders overtly address the issue of racism? I'll let any one of you who wants to start take that one. Oh, I'm going to have to be like the teacher and call on you.
I'm just so interested in everyone's answer to that question. I was like, I don't know if I want to go first. So you pick, Janet. You pick who goes first.
Oh, of course, you. Go right ahead. You have the mic.
So I get voluntold. I like that. Well, first of all, one of the things that Peggy said at the very beginning, I think is really appropriate to take into context here. Peggy said we were taught, much like she was, that we leave our emotions at the door, right? That somehow we believe that emotions don't follow us into our organizations. And following even just the topic of this conversation, that emotions and racism are really intertwined. You don't have racism without some strong underlying emotions. And so we have to acknowledge that they follow us everywhere and we ignore them at our own peril. So if we can't address the fact that no matter what race we represent or what our background is, that we have some underlying emotion about that. I can speak as a white woman that part of my own journey was reckoning with the fact that racism itself seems like a loaded word, and that somewhere along the line I was raised to believe that to talk about race was impolite. And so understanding why was that even a thing that I was taught, and how in and of itself that becomes a system in which voices cannot be heard. And starting to realize as an executive and as a woman who oversees the careers of other people, I have to learn how to manage my own emotions around these things, that I can have an emotional experience, especially, and as I know that for the women and executives on this call, that we get to a certain point in our career where we think we have to have everything figured out and everything has to be just right, and every word that out of our mouth has to be perfect. And in my experience, when we start to really address racism in the context of organizations, we have to be okay with not being perfect. We have to be okay with the fact that we're going to stumble on our words. We might say the wrong thing. We might ask a question that evokes some emotion in other people that we find a little scary. And I found one of the biggest parts of my own journey around making progress in this area is to make sure that I give myself permission to have all those feelings, and to not to stand on perfection as a reason to not lean into what Janet calls crucial conversations. And so I'll just pause there, Janet, because there's probably a lot I could say. But again, I'm really interested in what Bill and James have to say on this matter too. I guess I would just end with that we ignore emotions at our own peril. And if we ignore how we feel, no matter where we fall on the spectrum of race, it's really going to be a problem to be able to have the conversations that create breakthroughs for us, that allow us to all be seen and heard in the way that we deserve to be. You're on mute, Janet.
Thank you, Andrea. And before we go to the next one, I'd like to invite all of our participants to feel free to put your questions in the Q&A or the chat box, and we will be taking questions at the end of our conversation with our panelists. So we welcome you to join in the conversation. So, Bill, how about you? Would you take this one away?
Sure. And as an old white straight man, I seem like an unlikely candidate for this panel. In fact, I looked at Janet kind of funny when she asked me to participate. So I just want to give you a little bit of context of where I'm coming from on a lot of these topics. And I grew up in a house, Janet mentioned, with a number of adopted siblings. And so I actually grew up in a house with 8 Black siblings, and which really did change my perspective on racism from a very early age. Empathetically experiencing what my siblings went through, and then really getting some context around the challenges they faced at every level and every system. And then currently, as the CEO of Covenant House California, our staff is over 80% people of color. The young people we serve are over 90% people of color. So these are issues that come up literally on a daily basis, if not a hourly basis. And I think why it's so critical to address the issue head on is because it really goes to the core of who people are. And to deny it as leaders is really denying part of who they are. So if they're feeling these emotions, experiencing these things, and we as leaders ignore it or step aside or are afraid to deal with it, in essence, we're denying part of who our staff are. And I think that's just a critical mistake, not just as humans in relationship, but also at leaders trying to endear loyalty and people to work hard. And so I have found that even though we do make mistakes in this, it's absolutely critical that we have these conversations and that we set a tone of graciousness for one another to make those mistakes. And what I've found is people who believe that you are authentic and you're really putting in effort and trying to work hard towards making a better way, they're interested in giving you grace and making those mistakes and then moving the agency forward.
Thank you, Ben. James?
Sure. And before I jump in, I just want to take a minute and thank Peggy and the entire team at Watermark. And for all of you watching, I know it's a really busy time in all of our lives and the demands on our time are many. So thank you so much for just taking a moment out of your day to be part of this conversation. And certainly to Janet and Andrea and Bill, it's just an honor to be here with all of you. Why is it imperative that leaders overtly address the issue of racism? It's simple, because there's no such thing as sitting on the sidelines anymore. In today's environment, to be silent is to be complicit. You know, what 2020 has shown us is that acknowledging systemic racism is a bare minimum. And confronting it cannot be performative. It has to be authentic. Because if it's not, people are going to notice and they're going to let you know. This year, we've seen so many examples of things like that. So let's talk about authenticity. You know, authenticity needs to be appropriately contextualized. And what I mean by that is, let's take Twitter for an example. We've been at this a while, and while we may not always get it right, the commitment is clearly there. We have a track record. So when we say Black Lives Matter or call for criminal justice reform or justice for Breonna Taylor, there's context. And then we make sure that the words are backed up by action. You know, we've made really big financial commitments to civil rights organizations that are fighting for the Black Lives Matter movement. We made Juneteenth a company holiday. And in countries around the world where there are emancipation dates, we've made those holidays too. We've elevated the voices of Black creators and artists and activists and people who use our service on billboards and ads and in places where these protests were happening. And then internally, we've hosted company all hands that are intended to normalize discussions about racial equity, anti-racism, and social justice, and invite tweeps into these healthy conversations so they're more normalized and less uncomfortable. You know, most recently we had Dr. Ibram Kendi and Janet Mock, and even Jack moderated a conversation with the Equal Justice Initiative. So lots has happened and it'll continue to happen. The last point I want to make is that, so, okay, what if you're listening right now and you're thinking, that's great, but we're not Twitter. We don't have a track record of continually being invested in this work. That's okay too. You don't have to. If you're a company that's just starting this work, all you have to do is contextualize your journey in that way. Tell your employees and your customers what in this moment led you to this awakening, what commitments you're prepared to make, and then back that up with action and do the work. I think we all have a role to play.
Thank you, James and Bill and Andrea for that. And we do all have a role to play. And Bill mentioned he was the most unlikely person to be on this panel. And I just wanted to address that and say that Bill was the most likely person that I would ask to be on this panel. This panel is not by accident. We have representation from business, from nonprofit, from ed tech, and all of the walks of our life, and in businesses and in nonprofits with which we volunteer to support. And it's important that everyone is at the table in this discussion, particularly Bill and people like Bill, or in other words, white men, because this conversation is so critical and no one can be left out. But we're relying on white men to help us to lead the way in solving and dismantling racism. So we know that it's a process. We know that, as one of my mentors used to say, things take time, but it is so important that we all be at the table and we all work collaboratively together to resolve this complex crisis that we're having in America. So there was a saying by Martin Luther King: we have all come on different ships, but we're all in the same boat now. What do you see as the role organizations should take to honor emotions stirred by addressing systemic racism in America? James, why don't you start with this, and we'll just go in reverse order. No rest for them.
Sure. No, I really appreciate this question. Look, I am a queer Latinx kid who grew up in the Central Valley of California during the height of the AIDS crisis. I've been having uncomfortable conversations my entire life. And what I can tell you about them is that uncomfortable conversations are tremendous growth opportunities. And the last thing that we should be doing in this moment is depriving anyone of the kind of growth opportunity that an uncomfortable conversation can bring. And so what roles do companies play? Well, at Twitter, we focus on ensuring that these conversations are rooted in mutual respect and that they're healthy and productive. We all have to acknowledge that emotions for everyone are at an all-time high this year for many of the reasons, Janet, you've already pointed out. And for our employees from underrepresented groups, they often hurt in silence. So in recognition of that, let me tell you about some of the things we've done at Twitter. We launched something called Flock Talks last year on the heels of mass shootings in El Paso and Gilroy that targeted the Latinx community and left our tweets hurting, because we knew we needed to do a better job of bringing tweets together in moments of hurt or stress. And we've rather unfortunately had to do that multiple times throughout this year. We've had to continue them for the killing of George Floyd, most recently the End SARS movement in Nigeria. And these are tweet-only, confidential, off-the-record sessions where employees come together to hold space for people who need to share their emotions in community and be connected with allies. We launched a series called Take Care, which is an initiative that we recognized was an additional gap after the murder of George Floyd, where we brought in Black therapists to speak to employees, specifically who were experiencing racism-related trauma, and to discuss mental health, resilience, and how to practice self-care. For allies, because as we know, there are eager allies who want to be part of the solution. We created an Allyship Right Now series, which is intended to help people understand how to practice the principles of allyship in the context of what's going on in the world. We started the series rooted in how allies can speak up for the Asian community when the COVID pandemic started. We've repeated it again over the summer for how allies can respond appropriately and practice allyship during the Black Lives Matter movement. And then lastly, going back to emotions, because that's what this conversation is about. Folks are tired. Their mental health is under unprecedented strain. And so we increased our benefit offerings and launched a suite of mental health and wellness benefits for all of our tweeps. And we're really empowering managers to ask their employees to take advantage of these benefits. So, subscriptions to things like Calm and Headspace and Happify. We use Modern Health for therapists, and really ensuring that anyone who is experiencing this unprecedented level of emotions that is inescapable and has touched all of us in the workplace right now, that they know that they have the space, the resources, and are empowered to take care of themselves right now.
Thank you, James, for sharing those things that you're doing and how Twitter's leading the way. And I do want to say that I want to thank Twitter, because I reached out to them because of my reading on LinkedIn and other publications of the work that Twitter is doing, and how the CEO has stepped forward and owned his responsibility to lead change in this space. So I thank Twitter and you for being here today and sharing the ways you are leading the way. And then as I go to James, as I go to Bill next, I'm sorry. Bill, your story resonated with me. Covenant House is doing such good work with youth, and in particular, as you said, youth of color and Black youth. But your life experience is one that is so unique. And in today's world, as we know, with the new Supreme Court justice, there's been conversations about the adoption of Black children or children of color by whites. And you can share that experience about, if you will, with us, your personal experience and some of the things you've observed, learned, felt about emotions and addressing racism here in America.
Sure, and I'll start with just kind of contextualizing what James talked about for a smaller organization. We unfortunately don't have the resources that Twitter does, but everything what they're doing is some of the ideals that we would like to achieve. And without the resources, I think the critical points that he pulled out was really being courageous and having space for these opportunities, setting an environment where people can have these conversations in respectful, gracious ways, and then being a listener. I have a master's in social work, so people naturally think that I'm going to be a good clinician or a good listener. It's literally one of my worst skills, but this I like to do. And this is one of those situations where I have to go back to those skills and just be quiet and listen. And I will tell you that 95% of what we do as an organization does not come from me around this issue. It comes from our employees and listening to them, what's important to them and what are priorities. Things as little as, right after the George Floyd incident, our staff asked if they could get Black Lives Matter t-shirts to represent the agency. Sure, it's a no-brainer. It costs virtually nothing for us to do. I probably wouldn't have thought of that on my own, but it had such a profound impact on our agency for staff to be able to proudly wear those t-shirts and recognize that their agency supported them in that. And then as a demonstration to our young people to show them, hey, this is how you stand up. This is how you go to a protest and represent in an appropriate, effective way. Here's some opportunities to have a voice. So I think that's another one of the things that, I really heard from my staff was, as a white man in my position, I have entrance into rooms and opportunities that some of my people of color might not have. And it's given me a real different perspective on going into rooms when I'm talking to congressmen or talking to local politicians or even talking to donors, is how do I give my staff and the young people at our agency a voice so that people of influence can really hear what's going on, what's on their minds, and have context to be able to make change at a more global and countrywide level. I think growing up in the family that I did is a total gift. I actually ended up being an adoption social worker. And I think in an ideal world, every young Black child or person of color would be adopted by a Black family. And I think It's an example of some of the systemic racism that happened in the 80s and 90s through the crack epidemic, how it was not viewed as a public health issue like opioids is now. And so what happened was literally thousands and thousands of young Black children ended up in the foster care system due to the addiction of their parents. And instead of rehabilitating parents, it was simply take young people away and put them in different families. And unfortunately, there just were not enough Black families to care for all the children that were taken into the system. And one of the saddest stories that I've, heard in my family is my mom got a call from an agency and said, "Hey, can you take another kid?" I think by this time we had already adopted 4. And she said, sure. She went down to a hospital and saw a room full of 30 Black babies. And she asked, "Oh, which one is the baby that I'm picking up?" And they said, "Pick one. We don't have parents for any of them." So she picked the smallest one and brought him home. And now he's about 250 pounds and relatively well functioning. But I think what it did bring up for me was the ability to have these courageous conversations now, backed by 40 years of experience of having difficult conversations, as well as just knowing how important it is for my family and my siblings to be able to know that they have advocates for them. And I'll also tell you just the trauma that they experienced as the result of growing up in largely white areas and in privilege really compounded some of the issues of racism as well. And so it's been really fascinating to see how systems at every level really do have an impact on functioning when you're a person of color.
Thank you, Bill, for sharing that. Andrea, from the world of ed tech.
Well, I would start by saying that sharing the systematic and programmatic ways that Twitter and Covenant House are approaching having these difficult conversations and uncomfortable conversations is really lovely to hear about, and such a profound way to make progress. But I would also say that we can do that even at our own individual level as leaders. And I don't want to lose sight of that perhaps the structure we need to add to our professional discipline is making sure that we reach out and ask people how they're doing. And, Bill, you just illuminated how complex someone's emotional life can look like when they come to work in late October during a pandemic year, right before a national election, and when we've just had another police shooting of a Black man in Philadelphia. And, it's these things, we're having emotions about them, whether we ever say anything in our workplace about them at all. And sometimes the very simple question of how are you today can be the beginning of a beautiful growth conversation for everyone who's involved in it. And so I just don't want to lose sight of that I have to, again, as a leader, be aware of the own emotions that I have about it, or even the fear of what it might mean if I have a Black colleague and I say, "How are you today?" What's that going to turn into in a conversation? And be okay that I'm uncomfortable, but know that that's the way that we're going to actually make progress together. So that anyway, that's kind of where my thoughts took me on that, Janet, is that there's so much we can do person to person that leads to some of these beautiful programmatic and structural ways that we can change our organization to support people in large groups. But let's not lose sight of the power of checking in with one another as a leader to an employee or as a colleague to colleague that builds bridges that may have never been there before. I'm curious also, because I'm hoping this is a way we might be able to take this question to Janet, because I'm thinking about a conversation I had with a very successful Black entrepreneur who told me earlier in his career, he worked for a big Fortune 500 company and was promoted into a senior level position and invited to the first big offsite that this very small group was invited to. He was the only Black person in the room. And they get to their time where they're going to have a break between sessions, and everyone kind of cloisters around the coffee, and they closed him out. And it was very obvious to him that they didn't want him to be a part of their little circle. And so I think I mean, there's just a lot that we could unpack even in just that little interaction. But I think we have to be awake and aware enough of when we are excluding people in our own language, our own body language, who we even invite to meetings, and even beyond the check-ins. But again, within the purview of our own ability to be inclusive, to create equity in our workplaces, we have to first be aware of our own behaviors. And so maybe I'll just pause there and see what kind of response any of the three of you have to that, because it's, having that conversation really made me think a lot about how conscious can I be about who is invited into spaces, and how is their voice heard and accepted in the room.
Andrea, I really love that. One of the very first things that we do at our new hire orientation at Twitter, we call it flight school because,
yeah,
bird analogies are everywhere at our company. Is we do an exercise for day one. You're brand new at a company, and it's called the power of inclusion. And it emphasizes that inclusion is a mindset that has to be practiced and cultivated on a daily basis. Because what we know to be true, both in our lived experience and, as backed by research, is that when we don't consciously include, we unconsciously exclude. The vast majority of moments of exclusion don't happen by malintended actors, which is not to say that they don't exist, because of course we know they do. It's just people who didn't stop to think, am I including everyone in this discussion, in this moment, in this conversation, in this meeting that should play a role? And am I challenging my own assumptions around who belongs here, who belongs as part of this movement, as part of this company, as part of this moment? And taking us back to where we started, a measure of grace is so incredibly important, because cultivating an inclusive mindset is a journey that we are all on. And one of the things we know about being on this journey is that we're not always going to get it right. I've been doing I&D work for decades. I still make mistakes, but if you lead authentically with your heart, and you lean into the uncomfortable conversations with vulnerability and empathy, what I find, to Bill's point, is people are more than prepared to apply a measure of grace when you mess up.
And Janet, before we pivot here, I just, because you, as you pointed out, I co-founded an ed tech company, and so just addressing even the external product world, that's another area that we really have to look at, is how inclusive is the way that we built our product and our programming. What kind of visual representation do we have of the people that are in the program? Does this feel like something that is only for white people because a white person designed it and thought about white people when they built it? That's, to your point, James, that wasn't some evil plot, but it's just based on a worldview that has to be broken apart and allowed some light to shine in there so that it can be more representative and helpful to people, so that the product and the program looks like the people that go through it. So I think that there's this internal lens on how we communicate these things internally amongst our own leadership teams, and an external way of how we think about what we're producing in the world, and how inclusive does that feel as well.
You're right, Andrea. That's been a mantra of mine, having gotten certifications in emotional intelligence and all of these coaches certifications. And I raised that when we look at these assessments that we're doing, how inclusive were they in terms of the population, and how do we make that change and that shift? Because that is very important. One of the things that we have to go on and just believe, though, that the goodness in the world and the goodness of what's being imparted is universal truth that can be used by anyone of any color, and that we recognize that we have to make the adjustments and take into the considerations the environments that we are in as we look at these assessments and these AI tools that are being built for us to use. Before I do pivot, Bill, if you had anything on that, but if not, we will go to that next topic, which, go ahead, Bill, please.
Well, I would just say Andrea's example just highlighted, I think, the both the conscious and the unconscious power that white men of influence have in a lot of these rooms. And it really can go one of many different ways. And just imagine how, if that group of people was intentional about being inclusive, what a different experience that man would have had, how that could have impacted his career, his loyalty to that company, and his willingness to bring on other people of color up through the ranks. And so just that small demonstration that may not have been intentional had a profound impact on how inclusive that company was and could have been. And so I think those are the kind of things that sometimes we don't realize. We do have a decision there and a choice there, and that we need to choose wisely and be really conscious of those things.
Right. And being conscious of our differences, yet our sameness. And in leading to that, Judge Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Justice Anthony Scalia were best buddies. And there was a play about them back in 2015. And at the end of the play, the actor saying, "We are different, we are one." Mm-hmm. Given the divisiveness that we see in American streets, and knowing that some of the protesters will then face each other in the work setting, what is your advice on how leaders of teams and employees on the team can regulate their emotions?
I can go. Janet, if you know anyone who has learned how to effectively regulate their emotions in 2020, please introduce me to them because I want to know their secrets.
Andrew is the expert now. Andrew means no.
I cannot regulate my emotions right now. And if I can't, I certainly can't ask our leaders or our managers or our tweeps to. But what we can encourage and expect for our leaders to do is model how to channel them and manage and work through them in productive ways, and lean into some of the programs that we've created at Twitter, for example, that are designed to give people the tools to navigate healthy, respectful conversations. And most importantly, practice self-care. I made this point earlier, but, especially at a place like Twitter, where our mission is to serve the public conversation, there are always going to be tweets and articles and breaking news, and it is relentless. And so we really encourage our tweets to take breaks from their own Twitter feeds and breaks from our workplace. And a great, for example, is, in July, after we noticed that tweets weren't taking PTO and they weren't taking care of themselves, we introduced days of rest, global days of rest. That made a big difference, because what we saw was that the difference between taking a PTO day and a day of rest where the entire company takes a beat to practice self-care is that you're not tempted to check to make sure you're not missing anything, because the entire organization is doing it all at once. We cannot be expected to be our best selves at work if we're not taking care of each other and not tending to our emotions.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, I think James is exactly right. You can't manage what emotion you're feeling, but we can do our best to equip our staff to manage their reactions to those emotions. And I think, what we've been finding is this concept of emotional intelligence is so critical to this process. And it's one of the gifts I think we have as leaders, is to understand that adults can continue to learn and develop skills around their emotional intelligence that are going to make them more effective. And so we've really tried to spend a lot of time investing, especially in our mid and higher level leadership, on developing those emotional intelligence skills so that they can become more aware of how they're reacting in rooms. They can really understand their triggers. They can develop patterns of effective communication in tense situations. And then really they're modeling all these things for their staff. And so I think that investment in our teams has really been a key part of helping us kind of manage through this process. Like James says, it's messy. Self-care is an absolute critical piece of it, especially in social work where we're open 24/7. I mean, there's not a minute in the day where I don't get an email to from one of my staff who's working overnight or during the day. But being able to really set boundaries and give permission. As leaders, most of us on this call and watching are people who are generally working a different level than a lot of our staff. And they see that and they notice, and they are striving to be like us as well in a lot of ways and think that that's how you be successful. So really giving permission and modeling how to self-care, I think, has been a critical piece of this for me. So really being away from the office at times so people don't always see me here and they're like, oh, I guess it is okay to take a break. Or even taking vacation and having that out of office reply is something new that I've been doing over the last few months as well. So I think that's another responsibility that we can have along with, that helping around training around emotional intelligence, unconscious bias. It's just modeling good behavior that's going to enable people to take care of themselves.
Yeah, I would start, because I think, Janet, your question even encompasses like how do we harness the power of the full range of emotions that we experience, and there are some unwanted emotions that we'd want to regulate or find ways of down regulating anxiety or anger or some other unwanted feeling. That said, there are times where anxiety and anger might actually fuel better action on our part. There might be it might drive some urgency from us, or if we experience anger, which at its root is often about a feeling of injustice or unfairness, does that give us some clue about how to right a wrong? Whether that's about changing a policy or it's about stepping into a cause that we're very passionate about. So my feeling around this is the more that we can explore the full range of what we feel with curiosity and accept that we have the full range and that we're on an emotional roller coaster right now, and that we're not there's no win-lose here, that if we're feeling something like disheartenment or feeling discouraged or really sad based on what we're seeing in the news headlines, that's normal. As is feeling angry or upset or frustrated or enraged. It's normal. There's no abnormal emotions, first of all. Secondly, if we can acknowledge that and accept that in ourselves and explore that with some curiosity, then we have a much better chance of being able to acknowledge those emotions and determine if they're really helpful to our situation. And I love both Bill and James's focus on self-care. I would just encourage us to think about self-care not as an extra thing, but a way that we build it into our daily life. And there's nothing really glamorous about that. Self-care is not a day at the spa. Self-care is going to bed on time so that you can wake up feeling rested. It's eating well. It's taking breaks. It's checking in for yourself to see what you might need so that you can traverse all the full spectrum of emotions and find your way to fill the bucket again so that you can do that and fight another day tomorrow. So I would just encourage us to think about accepting what we feel and looking at how do I harness that or shift it based on the needs I have in the moment.
I just want to plus one that, Andrea. What we're finding is that, especially in today's environment where so many of us are working from our homes, micro adjustments can have macro impacts. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that we've done at Twitter is that we start all meetings at the 05 or 35. And what that means is that every single person has 5 minutes in an otherwise back-to-back day where they can take a bio break, they can, visit with their kids or their pets or their roommates or whatever. Mm-hmm. And you'd be really surprised to hear the feedback that we received of people say that 5 minutes has made such a difference in my day.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah, those small tweaks. And one thing about emotions is, as you were all saying, just great tips and advice. We've been taught not to be emotional, quote unquote emotional. We've been taught to push down whatever we're feeling, and in particular, if that emotion was one such as anger or envy or resentment or hatred or all of those things, as Andrew said, may be viewed as not so nice emotions. But the fact is, they are emotions, and the fact is that we are going to have them. And one of the things in learning and practicing emotional maturity and agility is this understanding that we want to tap into that emotion. We want to name it. We want to label it so that we can make adjustments and regulate our actions based on understanding what we're feeling. And I like to say it would be nice if we spent more time naming and labeling our emotions than naming and labeling each other. So as we go into our last question, I want to encourage our audience to please put in your questions in the chat or in the Q&A box, and we'll be able to take questions in just a few moments after this last one that we asked our panel. And there was a civil rights leader by the name of Ella Baker who worked in the movement back in the 50s and the 60s. And she had a quote that said, "Give light and they find their way." Psychological safety has been listed as one of the most important factors for employees to thrive. In organizations, competition manifests itself in so many different ways, and not always good competition or healthy competition. In our race to be relevant, how can leaders ensure that all races, quote unquote races, now that we understand the myth about race, but how can leaders work to ensure that all people in their organizations are relevant? And each of you, please. Everybody's on mute.
Well, that's a big question, Janet. So
we have the experts here to answer it, so thank you.
I'm just thinking about the way I might want to. I think partially, again, I'll just go back to how we show up as individuals goes in part to your question. And I'm thinking again about the science of emotions and how when we are feeling strongly unpleasant emotions, we are unconsciously giving off cues of avoidance. So the opposite is true when we feel pleasant emotions. We're giving off cues of approachability. So when we think about ourselves as leaders and the kind of environment that we want to create where all people feel like they can be seen and heard for who they are and that they're contributing in a way that's supporting their own well-being and is supporting the needs of the organization, I think we have to first look at ourselves and see, are we tuned into our own emotional states in such a way that I am aware that how I feel is having an impact on the people around me? And if I'm not, then I need to start there, because if I'm walking around irritated all the time, I'm not going to be very open or approachable to those that might want to talk to me, or will I even see cues that people need to talk to me? So if I can find a way to recognize what I'm feeling and optimize and shift my emotions to more pleasant states where I can absorb more information from my environment, where I can see people more completely, if we start at the micro and focus on how I'm contributing to an environment, or perhaps contributing to a dynamic I say I don't like, how do I actually shift myself so that I can change that dynamic? That's what I would say. I'd start there.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I would go back to something that James said earlier, is that if we're not doing or saying anything, then we're complicit in the negative things that are happening. So what can I do as a person, as a human? What can I do as a leader of an organization to change that, to demonstrate that we do care and that we can make a difference? And so, I think some of the things organizationally that we can do is, we have our diversity, equity, and inclusion committee looking at all our policies. Are any of our policies, negatively impacting people of different color? For a variety of reasons, systemic racism has been such a part of who we are as a society. There's things ingrained in how we function as organizations that we may not recognize. And so really taking a good look at those things. And then this is not about checking boxes. It has to be because we want to do the right thing and we want to make this place better for everyone, regardless of who they are. And how do we show up in ways that value everybody for who they are? When people walk into our HR offices, do they see representations of themselves in ways that they feel like, okay, this is a place that I feel comfortable, that I belong? So we've really started thinking about even those kind of visual things and how we onboard people. The training obviously is important, but things down to what are the pins people can wear on their lanyards? Are they able to identify their pronouns on their business cards? Things that may seem small, but they really reflect that the agency and the people involved in the agency are actually doing something and are listening.
I love that. And you set me up for a pro tip. Anyone who's joining a Zoom call can hover over the 3 lines that are in the top right-hand corner of their frame and edit their name and add their pronouns. It's a simple, straightforward micro adjustment you can do to demonstrate allyship for people for whom you might be empowering and not even know it. So Janet, I don't know that I agree that we should look at it that way. I think we should reframe the way that we think about making all races relevant and really understand what we're trying to solve for, which in my view is overcoming 400 years of systemic racism that has preferentially advantaged one race at the expense of all others. There's this quote, none of us are free until all of us are free. And right now, our Black communities are hurting. How many more Black men or women are going to become hashtags? I think the best thing we can do to also ensure that our communities heal is to understand, take a really clear look at and understand the powers that oppress, and then create ways to bring our allies along in this journey. Everywhere you look today, the Latinx community has been decimated by COVID. The Asian community has seen this huge rise in xenophobic attacks. Muslims are experiencing terroristic, violent acts in places like France. While all of these communities are different, the thing that they share in common is marginalization rooted in systemic racism. The opportunity in front of people of all races right now is understand how systemic oppression works, the role each of us play in confronting it, and then working together to build a more inclusive future where everyone belongs.
Thank you, all of you. And what a fitting way to end our portion of the discussion. I'd like to turn to question and answer. And Peggy is assisting with that. If she sees any questions, I see one here. Please share your thoughts on the recent presidential executive order that limits nonprofits or businesses that receive federal funds to talk about white privilege in their diversity and inclusion trainings. And open to anyone who'd like to take that. Like me to reread the question?
Oh, I mean, it's appalling. I mean, it's that's the short answer. is it's clear that we all need more of this kind of education so that we can, as James so eloquently talked about, is break down the systems that created the inequalities to begin with. We were all born into these systems. And so we have to learn how to see them with more objective eyes to change things. And it's really difficult to do that if the government itself is saying you can't learn about your own biases in order to break them apart and see differently. So that's again my short long answer on that.
Yeah, it's not just appalling. It takes us back to a place where we obviously don't want to be going. I mean, this was something that we felt so strongly about. We activated thousands of our constituents, including our youth, to write in letters and comments about this, because I think the people making those decisions need to be overwhelmed with a response that says, what you're doing is not right, and we don't agree with you. And so that's what we're a part of a number of advocacy groups that just tried to mobilize people. And I think that exercise in itself gave our young people and our staff to have a voice in ways that they may not have before. I think one of the benefits of some of the political environment that's going on right now is people are realizing they do have a voice, whether it be through social media or through their organizations. And these are opportunities, I think, for us to really make a stand.
Thank you. Thank you for those answers. And we do have a few other questions. We're coming on the top of the hour. So respect to those who do need to part at the top of the hour. We are going to wrap up right now. But Watermark is always so graciously allowed, and our panel has graciously agreed to stay over for about 15 minutes if we want to have an open discussion, and we can open the mic and let you ask your own question, or if you feel comfortable putting it in the chat box or the Q&A, we'll be able to do that. I'd like to end, for those who do have to leave at the top of the hour, there is a leader within Google, and I'm going to borrow a reflection that he uses in his meetings. His name is Paul Santagata, and he's head of industry retail at Google. And I was reading an article, and he shared this is the reflection that he uses in his meetings. Just like me, this person has beliefs, perspectives, and opinions. Just like me. This person has hopes, anxieties, and vulnerabilities, just like me. This person has friends, family, and perhaps children who love them, just like me. This person wants to feel respected, appreciated, and competent, just like me. This person wishes for peace, joy, and happiness, just like me. For those of you who have joined us, thank you so very much. And I know that you're just like me, and I wish you well in this journey of change and evolution within our country. So now, we'll go back to questions and answers, and Peggy, I invite you to assist us with this piece, please.
Thank you so much, everyone. It's been a really wonderful conversation. And as I usually do in meetings like this, I have a whole list of, things I'm writing down. I'm writing down all the things that you have said, and just the things that are kind of rising to the top for me, that sense of, the things that we can do in our daily interactions, that self-awareness, the self-care that leads to more self-awareness, that leads to more compassion for others, the audit that we can do of our policies internally in our organizations that can help us uncover how have all of the effects of many years of history impacted the way we hire, the way we evaluate, the way we interact with our constituencies, and that sense of those micro adjustments, and what a huge impact that can have. One of the questions that just came up from Caro Vera is how can staff motivate or move their organizations to institute changes to policies? And that is that can support people who are historically marginalized. And I think that's one of the things that I'm hearing about constantly, is that you can be a leader wherever you are in an organization now. And one of our jobs as leaders is to be open to leadership from everyone around us. So could you address that? And we'll wait for some other questions to come in as well.
I can jump in. So we have a program called Inclusive Leadership, and it's designed for everyone within the organization. So anyone can be a leader. I'll give you a great, for example. Approximately 80% of workplace culture, although we might have to revisit this for 2020, approximately 80% of workplace culture happens in meetings. And so, sorry, there's a small interloper that might make an appearance. And so if you've ever called a meeting, then you are a leader and you have an opportunity to lead inclusively. And when we talk about this at work and we're talking to large groups of employees, a lot of people think, oh, I'm just a manager, I'm not a leader, or I'm just an IC, I'm not a leader. And we ask, have you ever called a meeting before? Raise your hand. Everyone raise your hand. Great, you're a leader. You have an opportunity to lead inclusively. One, are you scheduling the meeting that is respectful and inclusive of people in time zones that should be part of the meeting? Are you scheduling the meeting in, this is obviously pre-COVID days, back when we would be out in the world, in ways that avoids key periods of time for parents with drop-off or pickup responsibilities with their kids or bedtime responsibilities? When you call the meeting, are you making sure that everyone who should have a voice in this conversation are included, not just the people who are your go-to people on the team? If there's a note taker, are you regularly rotating the person who takes notes in that meeting, so it's not always the responsibility of the most junior person in the room or a specific person? And let's be clear, it's usually a female. And so and then before the meeting is ended, have you recognized that there are introverts, extroverts, and power dynamics that take place in that meeting, and that as the caller of that meeting, you have an opportunity 5 minutes before your meeting's over to pause and say, we haven't heard from Peggy yet. Peggy, I'm curious to hear your voice, just to make sure that every single person has had an opportunity to participate in a way that's truly inclusive. Anyone can do that. That does not require that you have an executive title or that you lead a large team.
I would add too that I think even in that kind of environment where you're talking about, James, where we create a room where all voices are heard, that we also have created a comfort with challenging resistance to inclusivity. That there have been times where I've been confronted with someone's old ideas, or someone saying, well, no, that isn't racist, or no, that isn't, we shouldn't have to worry about that. I found that that there are times where I have to push against someone else's old ideas, and that we have to be comfortable doing that if, again, we want to make progress. So there's the environment in which we create, and also the content in which we have to address if we're really going to truly unpack and unwind some unwanted policies, procedures, programs, products, etc., that linger on as having problems with inclusivity.
Thank you. So I am just checking here. Just a lot of thank yous, and appreciate your thoughts. So panel, Peggy, let me check in with you. Do you have any more questions or anything for us?
One thing that I wondered if you could address before we close, several of you mentioned healthy conversations, and I wondered if you could each identify, what does that mean to you? We've talked about uncomfortable conversations, and we've talked about resistance, but modeling something that is a healthy conversation is perhaps new for some of us, and I wonder if you could define that more crisply.
Well, I would say that this is an example of one. This very format right here is, you've got people from a variety of backgrounds and a variety of different roles and different races, and for us to say, let's talk about it out loud and together is a way of detoxifying the name um, and some of the emotions that come along with leaning into that. So again, in my perspective, it happens person to person, and being able to both question and listen. I think the burden of a white person right now is one that's very heavy on listening. And not only do we need to be listening with both ears, but we need to be educating ourselves and not relying on our Black friends or our friends of color or Latinx friends to educate us on their pain or their suffering. And so I just find that we have to take responsibility in our allyship to educate, listen, and figure out ways that we can be a part of a positive solution. So to me, that's part of the whole package. And it happens one conversation at a time, and it happens one decision at a time about how can I really take my beliefs into action and help change things.
Yeah, I would add to what Andrea said about listening is to really kind of master our defensiveness as white people, and to understand that there's going to be a level of discomfort and you're going to want to say and react and, no, that's not me. But really listening and investigating and digging deep into yourself and finding out where some of those ideas came from and what they mean and how those have been reflected outward, and taking personal responsibility too. I think it's okay to be wrong. Like, James talked about before, a lot of it is really born in our life experiences prior to now, and can be just pure ignorance, and choices that were made for us and the ways that we were raised and what we were exposed to. So I think just be really open into the idea that what we know and what we've known might not necessarily be right, is really important part of this process as well.
I agree with everything that's been said. What I would say at the core of every healthy conversation is psychological safety. Making sure that people feel safe to discuss things that might be difficult to navigate. For me, in order to effectively navigate those conversations, it includes an emotional audit to see if I'm in the red zone or if I'm in a safe zone. If I am having a red zone reaction to something that I have heard or seen, I know that that is not the right time for me to try to approach a healthy conversation, because not only am I not going to create an environment of psychological safety for whoever I'm going to give a talking to, but it's just not the right time, place, or energy for people to experience psychological safety. The other principles and practices that Andrea and Bill brought up, using open-ended discovery questions, listening more than talking, challenging your own assumptions about motive, intent versus impact. You could probably do a Google search and find all sorts of great tips about how to navigate a healthy conversation. But just to end, I think they are at the core of being able to work through some of the things that we have discussed thematically in today's conversation.
And Peggy, I'd like to speak to that too. In having the healthy conversation, it's a two-way conversation. I find myself a lot in conversations where the men are listening so intently that they're not speaking up. So that can create a sense of lack of trust as well, because there's not a two-way dialogue when we're in these conversations. And I have since learned that others have told me that many men don't want to make a mistake, and they don't want to look as if they have, forgive that background noise, but they don't want to look as if they're vulnerable or not strong or weak. And that's what we've done with the masculine, feminine thing in our society. But I will say that it's important for men, and particularly men like Bill, white men, to speak up so that we know what their perspective is, so that we know how to interact with them, so that we know when we've made a mistake or when we have offended, because it is a two-way dialogue. And so that's so important that men speak up and be a part of the conversation and not just observe and listen, but build that level of trust by helping the others within the conversation understand their perspective and where they are.
Wonderful. Well, we are coming right up on 1:15, and I know you all promised to stick around for an extra 15 minutes. And so before we all have to hop off, I just wanted to say thank you so much for being here today, for sharing your perspectives, for sharing such wonderful advice, and especially to you, Janet, for pulling it all together for us. I hope this can be the first of many such conversations at Watermark, and that you all will join us again someday. We hope in person, and not just on Zoom, where more good things will happen. But thank you again. It's just such a valuable, necessary conversation, and I know that our community is very appreciative. So